ACC time here on the Y'all Show. Welcome into the show that we cover all things Southern sports. I'm John Rawl. Good to have you back here. And after a few days away, we're going to go now to our ACC insider, Jonathan Leifheit. We're going to find out what's going on in the Atlantic Coast Conference. It looks like Jonathan Leifheit of 24/7 Sports and CBS Sports Digital. Hey, I think we're going to have some football to be played. Is that what you're hearing?
It's starting to look more and more likely. Still not sure if it will be in front of fans or not, but it does look like it's going to happen. The NCAA has floated a proposal. It's not final yet, but a proposal that would have basically having football players report back to their respective universities on or about the 13th of July for some 2 weeks of like supervised workouts, and then they would take a little bit of time off and then resume with the normal camp schedule. So more or less what they're doing is kind of condensing and replacing the spring practice that was canceled for most schools, and then resuming with a normal camp. So to give them a little bit of time to do some conditioning over the summer, do some more installation like they normally do in the spring, and then pick up with camp after a short break.
Jonathan, you mentioned camp 5 weeks roughly or so for that, but are ACC schools right now allowing athletes to come back on campus?
Yes, they are. Most of them have actually allowed them back on. I believe it was on or about the 8th of June. I believe Clemson and I know Georgia Tech and others have done the same thing. So a lot of them actually have the students back on. They're in what we would call voluntary workouts. A lot of them are doing, I guess they're kind of scheduling. I can speak personally. I know that Georgia Tech is limits on the number of people that can be in the weight room, and they're also following some cleaning protocols that go along with that. You have to schedule time, and then you're required to maintain distance while you're there. So a lot of kind of rules that go with it, but most of the schools are allowing their students, their student athletes back on campus.
And I know the NCAA in their infinite wisdom is kind of drafting a plan right now, this 6 week plan, but how, if any, is that going to change on the ACC side? Is John Swofford, commissioner, likely to adapt his own philosophy for the ACC member institutions?
I doubt it. If anything, I believe the ACC, John Swofford, will be intimately involved in whatever plan they come up with that comes from the NCAA. So you won't see the ACC kind of doing their own thing. What you'll probably see is them influencing what comes down from the ACC, along with the other Power Five conferences as well.
So, Jonathan, with these athletes already back on campus at some schools, I'm sure the rest will be flowing in momentarily. How are they allowed to stay throughout the month of June until this 5 to 6 week plan goes into effect before the start of the season? What do you know about how long these athletes can be involved with what's going on their campus?
And most of them are not per se on campus. They're not staying in dorms. It would be likely a lot of them. You'll see a lot of the players, and this goes across the ACC. Either are local to the school, or they have their own apartment, off-campus apartment that they may be living in. Those are the ones that you're going to see back on. So as I mentioned, this was kind of a voluntary workout that they have going on. So from that perspective, it's only what I'm going to call the locals, or those that have local access, that will be part of those voluntary workouts until we get to the 6 week kind of the 6 week plan, if that's kind of the way it goes. And there's still some discussion of whether or not that 6 week plan may get reduced down a little bit to 5 weeks. They're a little concerned about if that 2 week period that I mentioned is a little too much. So you may see it shift a little bit, but it's looking more and more like we're going to have some football in some form or fashion.
Jonathan, that is great news. That's what we want to hear, football. And let's say football starts and you actually are able to work in a 12-game season. Well, your compatriots at CBS Sports Digital have just come out with an article, and it's by Tom Fornelli about the strength of schedule for the Atlantic Coast Conference. Bad news for Mike Norvell, Florida State. Bad news for Jeff Collins and Georgia Tech, because their two schools have the toughest schedules for 2020. I'm sure you've had a chance to see this article. What do you think about the strength of schedule article out at CBS Sports about
Yeah, and
the ACC?
I think they're absolutely correct. I mean, Georgia Tech I mean, I know as well as anybody, they're a non-conference schedule. You've got, Central Florida, Notre Dame, and Georgia all on there. None of those are easy games by any stretch. And then they also have Clemson from the other side of the ACC from the Atlantic. Their annual coastal Atlantic, shindig that they have. So that's three. That's right there. Four teams that have three teams that have been in the playoff in recent years, and probably a fourth that many argue should have been in the playoff at some point. So a lot of difficulty there. And then Florida State, Boise State. That's a group of five, but that's probably the best group of five conference over the last 5 years. And then they've got Florida as well in there, and I believe they've also got I think it was Notre Dame. I can't remember who the other Power 5 school is, but definitely then they've got their annual tilt with Florida as well. So they also have a pretty tough schedule.
And we're looking at some film over the last 20 years. ACCN has put out some of the great ACC teams of the last 20 years, and perhaps Georgia Tech and Florida State can be 2020's Cinderella version and find themselves amongst the mix of some of the best teams we've seen here. But a good job of ACCN compiling some of these teams. And I know that doesn't have anything to do with 2020, but it just shows you here in the variety of programs we're spotlighting here, thanks to ACCN. You got the Wake Forest of the world, Jonathan Leifheit, with an ACC title. The Georgia Techs of the world with ACC, they're claiming of that. And then, of course, Clemson has definitely been dominating that here in the last few years. But it's going to be an uphill climb for Norvell and Collins and their programs for sure here in 2020.
Yeah, for two coaches that are both early in their careers, they did not were not blessed with an easy schedule to build some momentum for sure.
All right, Jonathan, so as you mentioned, it looks like we're going to have some ACC football, something I know we all can get behind and get out there. Now, Dabo Swinney, Jonathan, he's been in the news here in the last couple of days for some of the things that have gone on in the Clemson football program off the field. Evidently, an assistant coach at one time is alleged to have used a racial slur. What more can you tell us about that, and why is this news now?
So you had a former Clemson player that brought it up, and the player that was directly involved actually has, I believe, corroborated the Danny Pearman is one of the coaches at Clemson. Apparently, one of the receivers made a comment that had a racial epithet, and he is black himself. Used it kind of against his own brothers, I guess you could say, his own brethren, in that respect. And then the coach responded back and said, "Hey, we don't say that particular racial epithet." And so one of the Clemson players heard that out of context, and then here we are a few years later, and he's reporting on it. And apparently, it was something that was addressed at the time, and it was talked about, but not everybody got the memo apparently on the Clemson team. And this is you get a player that's a little disgruntled or something like that, they'll look for things like that to pick up. I personally think everything they said about the incident seems credible to me, from Coach Swinney to Coach Pearman to the player involved. So I feel like they've done a good job of explaining what happened and what actually happened versus the former player's rendition of it.
All right, well, let's continue to go on with current events, Jonathan, because it's in the sports headlines. You've got two of Clemson's greatest players here in recent years in the news in the last couple of days, tying into what's been going on with George Floyd out of Minnesota. Two former Clemson players, DeAndre Hopkins and also Deshaun Watson, weighing in that Clemson's, their main building there, the Calhoun building on the campus, it should be renamed or changed because of the history behind John C. Calhoun. Oh, by the way, John C. Calhoun, it was his plantation there. I think it was Fort Mott, I think was the name of it, was the original land that Clemson University finds itself on. In fact, John C. Calhoun's son-in-law was a guy named Thomas Green Clemson, who gave the land what would become Clemson University upon his death. So a very close tie between the Calhoun family and the Clemson family, and that heritage goes on. In fact, John C. Calhoun's plantation home is part of the Clemson University campus, and now there's an effort by some of the players to get some of the stuff that has to do with John C. Calhoun, which, by the way, he died well before the Civil War began in 1861. And now these players are weighing in. Are you surprised they're doing this here at Clemson University?
No, I'm not surprised. I mean, it's indicative of the times, and a lot of folks, looking back, and certainly the major factor here is that John C. Calhoun was a slave owner, and I believe he had approximately 70 to 80 slaves, and that, as an African American, does not sit well with folks to have somebody that was a slave owner honored in any form or fashion, regardless of what their contribution was. And so that's signs of the times. The folks are looking at that stuff and going, why are we honoring a man that enslaved other people, and realizing while he wasn't part of the Civil War, he did participate in the ownership of slaves. And so that's what you're going to see. And I completely understand where they're coming from, and it would probably and it should be something that should be looked at in terms of how they honor him, and to what degree they look at him.
And by the way, his son-in-law, Mr. Clemson, was a Confederate officer, and I'm sure he was also a slave owner during the Civil War time period. And if that's not enough, the namesake of the main hall on the Clemson campus, Tillman Hall, he wasn't necessarily in the Civil War, but his actions after the Civil War, definitely a debate in the state of South Carolina. In fact, there's been an effort, I think, this week to get his statue on the State House grounds in Columbia moved, and it was Pitchfork Ben Tillman who created Clemson University as a land-grant school in the post-Civil War era. So some history here, and it's all tying in history with modern times here as we have our ACC Spotlight with Jonathan Leifheit. This is in the news. That's why we're talking about it, y'all. And again, when DeAndre Hopkins and Deshaun Watson, easily two of the top 10 players in the last couple of years, maybe top two if you want to know the truth, coming out and being very vocal about this. We have a transfer in ACC football, Jonathan Leifheit, as Michael Irvin II has announced that he's going to transfer away from the Miami Hurricanes. And what do we know about where he's going?
He is going to head just up the road to Florida Atlantic, and where he will be there. Willie Taggart, the former Florida State coach, has taken over following Lane Kiffin's departure. And so Irvin, he only had kind of marginal success and marginal participation at Miami. Also suffered a number of injuries, but certainly a big legacy being the son of Michael Irvin there at the U. But he has decided his last year he's going to head up the road just a few miles and play at Florida Atlantic and be an Owl.
He's going to be at FAU and not FIU, right?
That is correct. It will be Florida Atlantic.
Okay, because
I struggle to keep them differentiated as well. I will not lie to you.
Let me just help you here. Florida International University, they play their home football games, and their campus is actually closer to Miami Gardens, Florida, home of the Miami Hurricanes football stadium. They're closer to Florida, Miami's own home stadium than they are. Technically, I guess the Hurricanes should be playing at FIU, especially with some of the crowds they put in the whatever it's called these days. What is it?
Hard Rock Stadium.
Hard Rock. Okay, they've changed names about 20 times. I still go back to the days.
It might be MetLife Stadium. I'm not sure for sure either. I'm not even sure anymore.
I'm not sure. They're not paying us, so if we butcher it, so be it. Jonathan Leifheit. Yeah. Hey, we also have a little basketball update we want to share with everybody before we get out of here today. And that is a transfer related to the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. What do you know about that?
Yes, Wake Forest is receiving a transfer, and all of a sudden, his name has escaped me. Jalen Johnson. My apologies there.
Yeah, sorry.
He was originally going to be joining the ETSU program. Of course, Steve Forbes was recently hired as the Wake Forest coach from ETSU. So what he's basically done, he built a relationship there with Forbes and decided instead, as a graduate transfer from Tennessee, to go to ETSU. He instead is going to head just a little further east and head over to Wake Forest.
All right, so some basketball news going on right now in the midst of how things have kind of been shut down. And I know we started out this conversation with you, Jonathan Leifheit, talking football. Is there anything that you're hearing in terms of practice and players coming back from a college basketball standpoint?
Not yet. We actually had some time with Coach Pastner recently, and I don't think they've got a schedule set for that yet. They've got a little more runway to work with in terms of that type of thing. They'll probably practice usually starts in the middle of October. From that perspective, I expect that if they have on-campus classes, which I expect in the fall, that the basketball teams will just pick up with a regular schedule and just pick up the year as they would normally do it.
He is Jonathan Leifheit, the website 24/7 Sports and CBS Sports Digital. Thank you, Jonathan, for coming on with our ACC report, something to help us get through the month of June. And we know football season, it's going to come. It's going to come sooner than we might think. Thank you for your input, oh kind sir.
Thank you very much, and you guys have a great week.
All right, Jonathan Leifheit, everybody. Well, that will wrap up this ACC report. We'll have more from Jonathan as we roll through the month of June, so keep it right here on the Y'all Show.